2007 to 2022, which will be out in 2 days, unfortunately, 2 days too late, which has contributions from a few of the original, should I say, panelists of the 2007 Speculative Realism Conference in London, Graham Harman, Ray Brazier. Alberto Toscano has a piece in there, and we also have a piece by Slavoj Žižek somehow. So it's definitely worth a read when it comes out on Friday. So I'm just going to read out, quite boringly, with no PowerPoint presentation or anything, I don't know what anyone else is doing, but a few pages of some ideas that maybe we could pick up later in the kind of group chat. Okay, the word realism has always had its place in the history of philosophy. Defining the real or reality is commonly the goal for many philosophers. The real or reality of Democritus is a sort of reductive atomistic foundation. The real for Schopenhauer is the will and how it becomes bridled to representation. The real for Heraclitus is eternal change. The list can go on. Realism, other than the sort of bleak anthropocentric offshoots such as common sense realism and social realism, tends to chart that moment when the real or reality is at odds with the reality we identify in the first instance. This doesn't necessarily lead to skepticism, though. Descartes was a skeptic, but his final unity of reason and God leaves no stone unturned. Similarly, or inversely, Quentin Meursault is a realist without being a skeptic. He thinks that reality is a certainty, it's just not what we ordinarily perceive or quantify. For example, he turns Hume's skepticism about causality and contiguity into a fundamental ontological principle, which is there are no stable laws of nature. So there's a new tension here. It's in Platonic realism, the reality of essence apart from appearance. In contrast, going back to Descartes, the real in Descartes is for all to see. His thinking substance is obviously accessible to thought, and his extended substance is open to the measurements of matter in motion, qua mathematics and the physical sciences. There is a moment where the real withdraws or is too excessive for Plato, and this is what Hegel develops much later. The real or the truth of any matter must be seen through the whole, but the whole resists totalization in any actual instant. So this new sense of the real becomes to some extent alien, unknowable, speculative, and very irritating. What is the real for Kant? I'm not going to do every philosophy here, don't worry. The real is the correspondence of the a priori categories, time and space, with their empirical objects. When these two sides of the coin connect in an adequate manner, we have the product of synthetic a priori statements, ostensibly. Why is this a correspondence? Because Kant believes you can't find time and space. Sorry to just sound like a crash course in philosophy here, but because Kant believes you can't find time and space in the world as empirical objects. They precede experience and organize reality for us. The categories of time and space transcend our ordinary encounters with objects in the world. And reality in the last instance is when these logical categories match up with the objects of empirical observation. So in one sense, reality for Kant is basically human experience organized rationally. But on the other, there is a realism of idealism, the importance and necessity of these transcendental, necessary, a priori enabling faculties or ideas which precede experience. However, this is where it gets interesting, hopefully. Because Kant's philosophy is based on this correspondence of reason with the empirical, the a priori with the a posteriori, or even a type of phenomenology, there is something left outside this human or to human correspondence. What about the object before or after its schematization in the mind? What could matter be beyond the empirical? Kant's darker realism, which we all know now, which has been revitalized massively over the last 100 years, is the realism of noumena. Such a scary word, right? That which resists the phenomenal and that which resists the organization of consciousness. So there is a twisted Kantian realism here of noumena, which all the speculative realists have utilized in some manner. So I'm just charting a bit of a history of what this real could possibly be. So we're getting the idea that there is this Darth Vader of realism rearing its head every now and again. It's a real which does not match up to our conscious access to it, as in idealism of conceptual categories, logic, or even phenomenology. Nor does it match up to the largely successful analysis of matter and objects out there in the world, which is dealt with by the sciences. Science's assumption of objectivity, shall we say. This passage already has a hint of speculative realism in it. The idea that reality is irreducible to these dominant disciplines is something that Graham Harman would and has stated before. Reality cannot be undermined by the physical sciences, nor overmined by our representation of reality. It also has a hint of Meillassoux. Meillassoux would also argue that reality cannot be reduced to the commensurability of human experience with its objects, nor would he support the objective empiricism of the natural sciences. For example, Meillassoux' concept of radical contingency is not an empirical phenomenon. The dimension of chance that Meillassoux finds in the Kantorian mathematization of infinity is a form of indeterminism beyond even the grounds of empiricism in physics. For example, according to Meillassoux, there aren't even stable laws of physics or appearance in which radical indeterminacy could be conditioned by. So the rules of the game fundamentally change, and the reasoning, or more aptly unreasoning, of this radical contingency is found through a different form of argumentation than logical reasoning. Aristotelian logic, Hegel's syllogism, and any sort of empirical analysis. Maybe we can talk about that. He calls it demonstrative reasoning, but we can talk about the kind of use of that word later. So the speculative realists are eking out a new form of realism. I'm just slightly repeating myself here because it's important. That neither abides to logical categories nor scientific ones. There is a kind of Platonic initiative here, the separation of appearance from reality or essence, but there are no eternal or universal forms found in the speculative realist renditions of Platonic metaphysics. The reality beyond appearance, or the sensual for Harman, is a non-relational and hence irreducible reality, irreducible to any form of relation or mode of presencing. And the reality beyond appearance for Meillassoux is the radical contingency underpinning any appearance whatsoever, making appearance only one temporal event in an infinity of other non-given circumstances or dimensions. Hence, the temporality of consciousness, or anthropic time, is a relative phenomenon for Meillassoux, while the possibility of such time being otherwise, the radical indeterminacy of time, is what is absolute. I think that's a good distinction to bear in mind. Okay. I'm going to talk a bit about Ian Hamilton Grant and Ray Brazier, just slightly. I'm going to start, actually, ironically, talking about Meillassoux though. Meillassoux famously states in After Finitude that the history of philosophy after Kant has implicitly accepted that there can be no x without a givenness of x, no x without first a positing of x. We probably hear this argument all the time, and it gets kind of irritating. We understand Meillassoux' irritation at this form of argumentation. We are of the opinion that this sort of performative contradiction, or even tautology really, yes, I understand that when I encounter x, I must at the same time posit x, mediate x, think x, experience x. It must have, even in a Heideggerian sense, some level of affectivity on my being, but it makes no sense to believe that our positing of something gives that something its reality. This is one step away from Berkeleyan idealism. Or not, we can argue about this later. Here's just a quick aside. Hegel would say something similar. He would say that part of the thinking activity of an object, comprehension or simply experience, must be included in reality as a whole. Hence, if you eliminate the thinking activity, you are eliminating a dimension of reality. But this does not mean that some sort of reality in the most generic sense would not exist or persist without human beings. But it does mean that Hegel's reality, par excellence, is one that includes the awareness of reality as part of its existence. To be aware of being real makes it more real for Hegel. It adds a doubling effect. Reality realizes itself through human beings. This realization realizes the real, and hence the real contains that realization in it. Wow. It is absolute self-reflexivity of itself through something else, which turns out to be not through something else, because that something else is only a part of the whole anyway. Just sounds like phenomenology of spirit. It's so difficult. Reality is realization, realizing itself, aka spirit. This is more nuanced than other forms of anthropocentric idealist realism, because there is still a space for the real to realize itself, as I said before, or beyond human beings. It will just simply be a different level of realization. A different dimension of reality will be disclosed. But I think it's safe to assume that everyone in the audience feels more real, comprehends reality that bit closer, stronger, than someone who is, for example, unconscious. That's really quite a simple point that Hegel really thinks through and tries to flesh out, extend and progress. What is comprehension as an essence? Or what does the progression or development or culmination of comprehension look like historically, for example? Presumably, the vast majority of the universe doesn't know it exists. A planet, a meteor, a speck of dust does not know it exists. So what happens when a unique species comprehends its own existence and the existence of other things? Does the universe begin to understand itself through a small area of the cosmos we call Earth? Hence the birth of the Hegelian idea, capital I. Where does that idea fit within the universe, ontologically speaking? This is a question that I've talked about a lot in my last book, Hegel and Speculative Realism. The question is, what is the difference between a universe that exists yet does not grasp that it exists, and a universe that is slowly and painstakingly learning to grasp the reality of reality itself? Surely this must be a difference in kind and not degree, and surely these two sides constitute a very different ontological cartography. Almost finished, one more page. Okay, I had to just throw in some Hegel because I love the guy. Maybe not the right-wing Hegel stuff, we'll stick with the left wing for now. Not only is there a spatial critique of the form of correlationism that Meillassoux describes, so we wouldn't discredit the reality of some undiscovered planet just because we haven't discovered it ourselves yet. There is also a chronological critique that I think Ian Hamilton Grant utilises very successfully in his work. If what is real is simply what is posited, going back to the Meillassoux quote, then what produces that reality which we posit, or even what produces the positing? Ian Hamilton Grant has a twofold answer for this. For every product, there must be a process or producer, and this production must exist beyond human cognition, if only to avoid solipsism. And then number two, the difference between producer and product does not lay claim to a kind of Cartesian dualism of mind and body, or any dualism of substances, but rather as a sort of mechanism found immanent in nature itself, as thought and matter can already be viewed as different finite powers of nature, or can be viewed as ensconced in the object Earth, for example. Both matter and thought are Tellurian processes and can be analysed as Tellurian phenomena. So Tellurian being Earth. Okay, Grant uses this idea of antecedents to track a series of prior processes, so geological, historical, cosmological, which can be seen to mould and condition the actuality of an object-subject encounter. But he also shows us that this trace of antecedents can never itself be fully recovered. There's a hint of Derrida here in a way. There is always a prior cause that isn't accommodated in the subsequent series. This means, to a certain extent, that any object, such as a mountain or volcano, cannot be physically or metaphysically reduced to its site of contact, its correlation, or even the causa sui. Or even the causa sui of the Big Bang itself must have residue of a radical antecedent, which is paradoxically not included in the event itself, or perhaps partially included. So this antecedence, which is irreducible, going further back, is reality's irreducible nature, or put differently, Ian Hamilton Grant points to a reality that persists and subsists beyond any one actualized instant, or any one actualized object, or any one actualized form of consciousness. If you look back at the great book, The Speculative Turn, in 2011, there's a great kind of debate between Ian Hamilton Grant and Graham Harman, right, about the difference between process and philosophy of process and a philosophy of instance. I'd recommend that. Okay, last bit on Ray Braziak. Ray's book, Kneel and Bound, is really a collection of essays, but they all achieve the same goal. They pass through a method of deduction in order to point to a real. Some people call this a negative theology. So instead of pointing to a positive real, X, we look at what the real cannot be, or what the real cannot be reduced to. So for Ray, we cannot possibly equate the real in all its myriad and rich ways to neurology and science, but neither can be equated to folk psychology and the manifest image. Ray even suggests that these opposing images of Wilfrid Salazar's manifest and scientific images are fundamentally incompatible. The irreducibility of the real being partially exposed in this irrecusable gap between the two, actually. I think he's changed his mind on this recently, and he's kind of going for a stereoscopic view of combining, which Wilfred Sellers does really well. The scientific and the manifesting. Okay, the irreducible, okay, later on in the book, Ray will critique the same assurance of linking ontology with the real regarding Bourdieu, Laruelle, and even Meillassoux himself. But it would be wrong to assume that this level of critique does not make him a speculative realist. He may not want to be part of it anymore, and it's an orgy of stupidity, apparently. But he most certainly is or was. He was looking for a speculative real that eludes all the theories he was analysing. He readily admits in that book, and I quote, "Naturalism may not be the best guarantor of realism, and in subsequent chapters we will try to define the rudiments of a speculative realism." So what is Brazier's speculative realism? The compulsion of the unconscious to repeat the trauma of its own extinction. It's a cosmo-nihilistic take on Freud's theory of compulsive neurosis and why it eludes the pleasure principle. In one sense, this is indeed the primordial pull back towards the inorganic, the death drive being what constitutes the aim of all life, according to Freud. But it is Brazier's opinion that thought, or philosophy in general, may find enlightenment through this futile process of contraction. So let's go over some remarks on the trauma of extinction before I finish. Extinction is a return to an anterior nothingness. This nothingness cannot be retrojected. This is a Ray now. I would never speak so kind of, what's the word? In such a difficult manner that he does sometimes. This nothingness cannot be retrojected into the past or projected onto the future. The only temporality commensurate with it is that of the anterior posteriority proper to physical death, as that which seizes organic temporality but which cannot be seized by it. Thus, the repetition which is driven by death does not repeat the latter as though it were an earlier state of affairs experienced by life or consciousness. For the trauma which drives repetition is precisely what cannot be lived or consciously apprehended. Though trauma is real, its reality cannot be calibrated by the life of the organism, just as it cannot be commensurated with the resources of consciousness. Accordingly, it is because the originary traumatic occurrence was only ever registered in the unconscious rather than experienced that there is a compulsion to re-experience it, but it can only be re-experienced as something that was neither lived nor experienced, since trauma marks the obliteration of life and experience. Nevertheless, the fact that experience cannot obliterate itself points to the reality of trauma, which cannot simply be a function of experience. Brazier later goes on to suggest that this repetition of the inorganic within the organic is in fact what individuates creatures and later humans, and it is this individuation which is given to thought as the objective reality that already determines it. He talks about, he uses Freud here about kind of the excitation of the external world and having to create a shield and kind of killing off part of ourselves. So like shedding skin or shedding certain elements of, like on the surface of our retina to be able to deal with the constant excitation of the world. And this type of individuation is kind of the organic kind of killing itself slowly and turning into the inorganic. He sees this as a kind of schism. Okay, so there's much to unpack here. This is me now. There are already two irreducible reals or realities fueling Ray's thesis. One, the irreducibility of extinction, which is neither empirical, it cannot be experienced, nor rational. It transcends the existence of any rational being, and hence any application of reason. We could say that it transcends the empirical and rational simply by obliterating the conditions of their possibility. Number two, what we are compulsively repeating is an origin which is not chronological. The death drive, according to Ray, cannot start with the first inklings of organic yearning. The death drive for Ray is the drive towards the inorganic, and this inorganic is more concomitant with non-being as opposed to the beginnings of life. Hence, this irreducible real is the reality of non-being for Ray. Ray believes that the will to know, or even the ego in Freudian terms, is constantly, you could say eternally or atemporally, struggling with these two irreducible realities. In fact, they both become the same thing, the inorganic and extinction as two trajectories of non-being. Hence he hauntingly writes, everything is dead already. It strives to become equal to the trauma of the in itself whose trace it bears. Ray hereby equates the Kantian term in itself with extinction and the inorganic because they point to a reality which transcends not only phenomenality but also life itself, and also time for that matter. It is a point of pure nothingness where there is no difference in itself, no distinction, no dialectical in itself, or for us scenario. Whether it is the return to pure non-being in his notion of the inorganic, or the obliteration of all that there is in his notion of extinction. Both processes point to a nothing in and of itself that is absolute, which can be traditionally equated to the notion of in itself in the history of German philosophy. We have discovered that extinction and the inorganic strive to become equal to the in itself, an in itself which has real traces in the former too, characterised by Ray as cosmological trauma. That is the part of the real that, if you like, we get to own, subconsciously, might add. We later discover that philosophy, according to Ray, attempts to think this trauma. So it begins to transform this real from unconscious to subconscious, in Freud, for example, to now conscious through philosophical reflection. Philosophy tries to make conscious its own compulsion towards the inorganic and towards extinction. In some strange Hegelian way, the identity of identity and difference is achieved. Knowing that in itself, through these registers, makes such actually commensurate with a form of knowledge, doesn't it? But only because knowledge accepts the fatalistic drives that condition it. A form of absolutism is achieved here, but at the expense of the Hegelian absolute being absolutely emptied out of all content, aim and idea, i.e. absolute nothingness. What Ray does not mention, however, is what the will to know will try and do about this inevitable return to absolute nothingness. If it is indeed fueled by this nothingness, yet simultaneously scared, traumatized by it, can it muster enough cerebral invincibility or prowess to do something about it? After all, there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of. I think I've finished there. I hope I wasn't past my time, was I?